The Isle of Man Steam Packet Company is the oldest continuously operating passenger shipping company in the world. There had been various shipping companies serving the Isle of Man before the formation of this one, but in 1830 their crossings were irregular and vessels used were unreliable. The Manx people felt they should have their own dedicated, affordable, secure service, and the forerunner of today's steam packet was born when on the 30th of June 1830 the brand new vessel the Mona's Isle, built at a cost of $7,250, sailed from Douglas to Liverpool on its very first sailing. Throughout its 188 years, the company has been owned by a number of private shareholders and financial institutions. In May this year, the Isle of Man government concluded the deal to acquire the company and its assets at a total price of £124 million from the Portuguese Banco Espírito Santo. The company started its life to provide long-term stability to the island's lifetime ferry operations. And that's exactly the same reason given by the Treasury Minister Alfred Cannon as he signed the formal agreement to buy the company. Now, the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company is the people's shipping line. So what are we to expect? Will we see major changes in the way the companies run? Will the cost of travel and freight come down? Will we see new ships? Will we see an expansion of its operation and services with new destinations? Or will it be business as usual, returning to the public purse a reported 36% profit, almost 3 times the industry standard for ferry companies throughout the world? Well, now the deed is done, and to help us explore a little of the past, present and future, we welcome to Sunday Opinion, as this week's studio guest, the chairman of the Steam Packet Company, Robert Quayle. Robert, thank you for joining us today.
Good to be with you, Roger.
Yes, I'm afraid you've had to gallop in here, I gather, from Patrick today, which was...
Yes, I thoroughly... here's a bit of advertising. I thoroughly recommend everybody to go to sample the Flower Festival. We opened it at Patrick Church this morning. And it was a sight beautiful to behold.
Right, well, let's just have a look at the subject in front of us now. The government's purchase of the steam packet to start with. It's not been said this, but I'm assuming that it was a willing seller, willing buyer arrangement, was it?
Well, certainly our shareholders, and there were actually 4 shareholders, Roger. It wasn't just Banco Espírito Santo, which actually ceased to exist some time ago. It was called Novo Banco. But it was indeed a Portuguese bank, but there were 3 other shareholders as well. Yes, they were willing sellers. At the price obviously agreed was satisfactory to them. The board had very little input, and they decided they wanted to sell. I think they probably were influenced in that by Tynwald's rejection of their own proposals for the future, and they felt that probably this was the best exit route they could have. So they were willing sellers.
I suppose there was the lurking issue of the renewal of the user agreement.
Yes, 2026 was looming. We had come to Tynwald before that because we felt that it was time to get a longer term agreement in order to allow the investment that the route was inevitably going to need. Tynwald in its wisdom decided that our proposals were not satisfactory and wanted to look at other proposals. I personally regret that, but at the same time that was Tynwald's decision, and then Tynwald decided that it was going to explore the possibility of buying the company. I think you've described us as public sector. I think this is the first time in my political memory that Tynwald has bought a going concern, and particularly a profitable going concern. It's bought assets of failing businesses in the past, like the bus company and the railway company, which I bought for government 40 years ago. But this is the first time they've bought a very profitable company, a well-run company, and it's going to be very interesting to see how they manage that acquisition.
Well, Howard Quayle said that it's acquiring the national asset. The national asset is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Would you go along with that?
Well, you're talking to the man who wrote a report, along with other much more distinguished luminaries, about how government should do less rather than more. So you wouldn't expect me necessarily to agree that actually it's desirable for the government to buy in assets and more particularly run them. But it certainly was an opportunity. I should say that Tynwald has been given the chance to buy this company in the past and rejected it, as recently as within the last 10 years.
Did it not once hold about 15 or 60%
It
of
held
the shares anyway?
getting on 30% at one stage, and because that proved so ineffective in the views of Tynwald members at the time, and I was clerk of Tynwald at the time, they decided to sell it, and they did. And so they tried it once, but that was, to be fair, not a controlling interest. It was a significant interest. Incidentally, Roger, you said that the company had been owned by private shareholders and financial institutions. Of course, it was effectively publicly listed for many years. I mean, shares were freely traded. And the annual general meeting at the Palace Hotel used to be one of the great social festivals of the year, when everybody stood up and made great long speeches about how the company could be run better and this sort of thing. So the Manx social scene was the lesser when those meetings ceased to exist.
Well, Manx Radio had been known to broadcast them.
Oh, that's right.
So, interesting entertainment on occasions too. Yes.
And I was involved in helping to take the funeral of one of those great participants at that annual general meeting only on last Thursday, Mrs. Leventhorpe. There's a voice from the past.
Indeed. But the company previously being run by the current shareholders, or under the current shareholders' direction, to maximise profits, I assume.
Well, that's why you run a business. I mean, you run a business to make profit. This was a regulated business. It still is a regulated business. So there are effectively parameters set as to how much can be charged for the services the steam packet offers. And of course, there's also the additional constraint of how much the marketplace will bear. And those have always been factors that have limited the amount that the steam packet can charge. Yes, it has been profitable. I would argue that it has been profitable within those constraints because it has been exceedingly efficiently run, with a minimal staff and everything designed to be as efficient and effective as possible. But it has been profitable, and it's been very well run over the last 10 years, and our shareholders have the shareholders who sold out, it has to be remembered, were reluctant shareholders, bar one. They had acquired their shares because the previous shareholder, which happened to be the Papua New Guinea Teachers Pension Fund, lost everything when Macquarie walked away. And so the three shareholders out of four who sold were all lenders who had to effectively turn their loans into equity. They didn't, in fact, but they became shareholders. And 3 out of those 4 selling shareholders lost money on the deal. So this slight fiction that shareholders have made vast amounts out of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company is actually less than true. There's quite a few shareholders who haven't made money.
Did Macquarie's make much?
Oh, I think they made quite a lot of money, but they walked away. You better not get me started on that.
Well, we did a programme, some years ago on that very subject, and it did look at the time, putting it bluntly, that they were bleeding the company.
Well, they overvalued it. They persuaded a whole lot of respectable financial institutions to put a lot of money into it. They then managed it, and when it didn't actually work out according to their own predictions, they walked away.
Well, there's a fear that profit is being stripped out, even now, to service the debts of the company.
Well, when you say profit's being stripped out, Roger, I mean, what has happened is that the company has been profitable, and it's up to the shareholders as to how they use that profit. It has gone to paying interest, a special low rate of interest on the debt. When the debts were restructured at our instigation to ensure that they were actually manageable, the rates of interest were very favourable. But there was also all these shareholders were sitting on substantial historic debt, and they were rather hoping that the company would make profits which could come back to them and help eat away at that long-standing debt. And if they traded till 2026, as was their current intention, they would have made a substantial inroad into that historic debt.
Well, now the company is completely owned by the Isle of Man government, and if the government, one has to ask, has spent 178 million, or 120, what was it? 124 million in obtaining this company, is it reasonable to assume that they know what they're going to do with it? As chairman, have you been given any clue or any direction?
Well, I've met the Treasury Minister, and I think the next few months are going to be very interesting as we discuss the parameters within which Tynwald will exercise its rights as the owners of the company. They are the owners, therefore their word is obviously very important to us, because directors run a company for the benefit of the shareholders. I mean, their duty is to act in the best interests of the company in the widest possible sense, not, as a member of Tynwald suggested this week, in the best interests of the Isle of Man. The Isle of Man is a stakeholder, but there are a wide variety of stakeholders we have to take into account. And we will obviously be very aware of what the government wants to do. They can sack us if we don't do it. I mean, that's the simple truth.
So have you got the same board running the company now as you had before?
No, we've got the same 3 executive directors. My 2 non-executive colleagues who served with me for 10 years, whose contribution was great, and I miss them greatly. But there are 2 new non-executive directors who are nominees of the Isle of Man government.
Right.
When I say nominees, they'd been nominated by the Isle of Man government. There's no such thing as a nominee director, but they've been nominated by the Isle of Man government.
So there you have a board, a half new board anyway. You've got a new board.
Two out of 6.
Yeah,
Yes.
new company.
Yeah.
Old
company, but new owners.
Okay, yeah, that's right. But you haven't yet got a brief as to what to do. I thought it was rather strange. I noticed one of Ray Harman's comments was that they, whoever they were going to start now negotiating with the company.
Yes, I'm slightly scratching my head on that. I think there are going to be discussions, but I'm not quite sure how you can negotiate with the people who actually can sack you if you don't agree with them. So it'll be very interesting. I think my overriding concern is that the Tynwald and / the Isle of Man government makes its mind up what it wants to do with the company, because although there was unanimity in buying it, I think there were so many different views being expressed either vocally in the debate or sotto voce as to what motivated people to go for it. There were the people who followed the Treasury Minister saying this is a good strategic purchase, it's a good investment, it's a profitable company, let's go for it. Then there were those for whom, frankly, at the other extreme, they have always dreamed of owning the steam packet company. They regard it as, quotes, a national asset, and they've been bringing it home to the people of the Isle of Man. They have every intention of interfering in its operation, despite many people saying, well, we mustn't interfere. Well, I think Tynwald's got to make its mind up as to what it really does want to do with the company, because if it's going to be run commercially, clearly that's not going to suit everybody.
Well, that takes us really to the question then, is the future going to be a company that is run as a commercial company for profit, or is it going to be run as a public service?
Well, I think the Treasury Minister says it's going to be a company run for public, for profit. I think there are a lot of his colleagues in Tynwald who see it as being run for the national interest. And I'm intrigued that there was a headline in one of the newspapers from Travel Watch this week, which is a sort of self-appointed pressure group, saying, design your own steam packet company, and citing, as others have done, the example of Caledonian McBrain in the Scottish Islands. Well, I think that's a dangerous precedent to follow, because CalMac is owned by the Scottish Executive. It receives a subsidy in excess of £100 million a year, because it doesn't run profitably. It doesn't own its own vessels. They're owned by a different nationalised company. And they have these consultation groups, local interests. Well, all those have done is to ensure that any kind of efficiencies, manning reductions and this sort of thing, are going in the dustbin, because the local community don't actually want it run in a cost-effective way. They just want the service. And there's a balance.
But there were also a lot of different islands, probably with different priorities.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, just to give you one example, some years ago we tried to charter in a vessel from CalMac for the TT, which would have been enormously helpful to us. We knew they had a spare vessel on the Stornoway route, because they'd acquired a new vessel. But we then discovered, despite the best interventions of Mrs. Sturgeon, that actually the local community had been promised that the old vessel would be kept on warm layup with a crew, with engines running, in case the new vessel failed. And there was no way in which they were going to release it to a short-term charter to us. And that was costing them something like $3 million a year to do that. Well, once you start doing those sorts of things, you start eating into your profit very quickly.
Now, the public, obviously, there's going to be public expectations. We have heard over the ages that people think the steam packet should be cheaper and they think it should do this and that and the other. This is the tailor-made thing that Travel Watch is talking about. But the two things that stick out from everything else is, one, a reduction in freight costs, and two, is cheaper travel in the main. Now, that's going to be a pressure put on members of the House of Keys, isn't it?
Yes, it is. And I think that even if we were to almost pay to transport people, the fares would still be too high. I think people have got a very unrealistic expectation of what travel really costs. I mean, I use public sector transport in the UK, trains and things like that. Those prices can vary enormously on when you buy your ticket and whether you go for a fixed sailing or what, journey or not. Yes, I mean, cheaper fares may be achievable. We used to offer, well, we still offer, something like 800,000 journeys below the regulated fares in a year. But an awful lot of them aren't taken up.
Not below your list price, you're saying regulated fares.
The regulated fares,
That's those set by the government,
yes.
In effect.
In other words, the maximum we can charge. We offer vast numbers of those, but the fact is, you use those fares to try and generate business at a time when people don't want to travel. And there's not a very high proportion of those taken up because people don't want to travel at that time. They want to travel during the TT. And of course, one MHK has apparently said, oh yes, well, it'll be cheaper fares for the TT. I find myself asking whether any other island businesses, such as self-catering accommodation and hotel rooms, reduce their prices for the TT. If they don't, why should we?
But they might not have the same impact on the island's economy as you. I've heard people saying this last year they're not coming again because they can't afford your fares.
Well, that may be the case, but we seem to get we have no trouble in filling the boats during the TT, Roger. I mean,
But you brought less people this year.
That's because less people wanted to come.
Because maybe they couldn't afford it.
Well, yes, but the other argument is that it was not a good TT last year, and that always has an impact. In advance bookings, we're well ahead of the game for next year already. I'm not disagreeing with that, Roger, but at the same time, I think that you've got to look at it in the round and say, yes, it may cost a lot to get here. That's the headline, but actually, do any other businesses reduce their costs? No, they don't. I mean, that's their time when they make their money that keeps them going for the rest of the year.
But when you look at the cost, maybe, of a small van, this is actual small van, 2 passengers and a bike for £560, that does seem a lot.
Well, it depends when you booked it, of course. I mean, I can't comment on an individual fare.
No, but I'm taking
because our fares
average.
do vary. Our fares do vary. Our fares do vary. But a lot of people are bringing their bikes over in vans now, and we encourage that because it actually is much easier for us to load.
But you charge for the bike in the van?
No, I don't think we do. Well, I think we just charge for the van, actually, Roger.
Okay. So, well, it's the TT is one issue, though.
Yes.
That's not going to go away.
No, and of course you have to remember that we design our fleet for the TT. If we didn't have the Seacat, which a lot of people see as a rather expensive option, we couldn't actually do the number of rotations and bring the same number of people here for the TT as we do. I mean, people talk of having 2 conventional vessels. It would be much more sensible. We couldn't do the TT in its current format without Manannan or a Manannan equivalent.
The other grumble about the TT these days is that people feel you've abandoned Ireland.
We've abandoned Ireland. Well,
the amount of service...
You might say that Ireland has abandoned us because, unfortunately, the carryings from Ireland, maybe a chicken and egg situation, I accept that, but at the same time, the carryings from Ireland were so low that actually it didn't make any sense to take vessels off routes where there were people queuing up to come, to put them on island route where you can get as few as 25 people on the vessel. That's an awful expensive trip for Manannan to go over to Ireland for 25 people.
Well, it depends whether you want to get on a boat at 3 a.m.
Well, I accept that, yeah. But Roger, you also mentioned freight. Freight costs, yes, I accept that freight costs will appear high. They went down significantly after that brief period of competition from Mezeron. One previous chief minister said to me, he said, I'm not interested in you talking about reducing freight fares, because he said it never actually works through to the customer who's buying a loaf of bread or a packet of biscuits. unfortunately, evidence shows that cheaper freight fares doesn't necessarily get reflected on the prices in the shops.
All right. Well, I understand the logic to that. However,
well, that's not logic. That's evidence.
Yeah,
I mean, that's evidence based. Yeah.
Oh, okay. But now the steam packet now owns 2 vehicles, and is the other one hired?
Yes, we call it charter in the shipping world. Yes, it belongs to a company called Seatrack, and that vessel is chartered. I should say that the local board fought very hard to ensure that we did have spare capacity and a standby vessel. We make it pay for itself by subchartering it out. Condor use it for some of the year, but it is on callback if we urgently need it, and we use it, of course, during the TT period to provide additional freight capacity. One of the things in the proposals that we put forward in the new Strategic Sea Services Agreement was that we should keep the Ben McCree when it was replaced as the standby vessel, which makes entire sense because it's passengers and freight. It would be much more versatile than the Arrow. But obviously we've got to have to buy a new vessel for the Ben McCree to move into standby mode at some stage.
Well, if I read Ray Harmer's comments of this last week, a new vessel isn't on the agenda at the moment. It's in some of the...
Oh, that's interesting. I didn't know that.
Not yet.
Well, I mean, it's going to take 3 or 4 years to get a new vessel.
So the other vessels are up to it, are they, for that length
of time?
Oh,
yes. I mean, they are 17, 18 years old, the two vessels that are in our ownership. They have been given a very clean bill of health. There is no reason why, with proper maintenance, and we do look after our vessels extremely well, they should not continue, well, for 30 years, really. But obviously it would be good to get a replacement for the Ben McCree because it reduces the amount of hours it has to be used. The Ben McCree probably is the most used asset the steam packet company has ever had. I mean, it's constantly on the move. 40 years ago, the steam packet's average use of its assets was 6 hours out of every 24. I think the Ben McCree is used probably 20 hours out of every 24, and it's been that all its life, 364 days a year. Well, it's been well looked after, but, you know, eventually things do start going wrong.
Well, the steam packet, of course, used to lay up a significant part of its fleet in Birkenhead in the winter.
Well, and some of them in the harbour here in days gone by. Yes.
So all of this, of course, is centred around continuous talk about the user agreement.
Yes.
Which is not the easiest thing to understand in places, but there are simple headlines in it that you have to provide so much in sailing, so much within a cost, and so on. What is the main thrust of that agreement?
Well, that agreement was put in to protect the island, 25 years ago, after a time of extreme volatility in island sea services, and it was effectively ensuring that there was a minimum agreed level of service, and that prices were kept within some kind of control. And initially, the prices could only be put up by inflation less, RPI less 0.5%. It's now RPI that those prices can go up. And that was to ensure that an unscrupulous owner couldn't just jack up prices through the roof. But it required minimum levels of service. It dictated what vessels were available, what ports could be used, and things like this. And I have to say that my personal view is that the user agreement served the island extraordinarily well. Yes, it did create, in a sense, a value to the company because it was like a franchise that it guaranteed an income stream. But I think that was a small price to pay compared to the certainty, the regularity, and the affordability of the services that we have offered.
Well, that was government ensuring that a private operator provided at least a minimum service.
That's
right. But now it owns the company. Is it going to need a user agreement?
Well, I think it depends, goes back to our original discussion on exactly what a government going to do. They own the company. They can effectively dictate what we do. I understand that the initial discussions will be on a shareholders agreement and an operating agreement, rather along the lines of Manx Radio, Roger. And don't forget, I was director of Manx Radio for 10 years back in the day. And that was, in a sense, operated at arm's length by government. I remember the government secretary and government treasurer coming once a year to meet the board, but it had a subsidy for a start, and secondly, it had a licence from the Communications Commission, which set out what it could and couldn't do.
But there was a separation of functions there, because otherwise it would not be able to do what a media and a journalistic people would be able to do if it was too tightly controlled by government.
Yes, and I can remember members of Tynwald saying, "Why is Manx Radio saying that? It's owned by government. It should be actually promoting the good things about the Isle of Man and not being critical." I think it's a real dilemma that I can't solve for members of Tynwald. Members of Tynwald are going to have to solve it themselves. They bought the company. They're going to have to decide what constraints they're going to impose on themselves on how they run it. I mean, what I think they failed in their sort of wonderful idealism in having bought the company to realise is that the steam packet has always been a slight political football. It's going to become even more of a political football, and they won't be able to say, well, it's not, we don't own it, we can't do anything about it. They do own it now, and so it will actually be harder to say we're not going to do that.
Public expectations always can be very unpredictable. I can see some people ringing their MHK up at 8 o'clock in the evening and saying, I didn't like the meal I had on board.
We've had two examples in the last few days, Roger, since government bought the company. The first was a lady who'd taken her dog into a cabin, and it wasn't a dog cabin, and she was asked to remove it. And she said, "You don't tell us what to do. We own the company. We tell you what to do." And then there was a man who'd booked his rather large vehicle onto one of the busiest pre-TT sailings from Liverpool. He was told he didn't have the right ticket, but we would try and accommodate him. When he was told where he had to park his vehicle, he violently objected and stopped his vehicle on the loading tray, and took exception to being told to move, and then he wrote emails to 3 MHKs demanding their involvement. Well, I mean, MHKs now own the company. It's
Manx Radio.
In today's Sunday Opinion, we're in conversation with the chairman of the Isle of Man Steam Packet Company, Robert Quayle. Just looking there while the break was on, Robert, you know, the steam packet has always been in the public mind and the public discussion. The very first Sunday Opinion, would you believe, in 1977, just about February, March, had Sid Shimmin, who was then the manager of the steam packet, and Roy MacDonald on, arguing the devil over the fact that Roy MacDonald said we should have roll-on, roll-off ships, and Sid Shimmin says that people wouldn't use them, they're not important.
Yes, I can remember a conversation with the late John Clucas, who was a member in the 70s of the Harbour Board.
He chaired that programme.
Was it really?
Yes.
And he said they'd gone on board, that somebody brought a sort of hydrofoil over to the island which had plush seats. And apparently Sid Shimmin was shown over this vessel, and Roy MacDonald said to him, "Why couldn't we have seats like that on the steam packet?" And Sid thought for a moment and stroked his chin and said, "Well, you couldn't wash underneath them." Because you remember the ships used to have sort of wooden slatted seats. People forget just how rudimentary it was 40 years ago.
Except for the posh lounge, yes.
Oh, except for the posh lounge, yes. Well, you know, we'd like to bring that back. Silver service dining room would be very nice.
But those sailings, even in those days, Liverpool was mainly the place to sail to, and Fleetwood. There wasn't a Heysham in those days. And now today we have rather limited, and Liverpool is likely to get some significant change, having been kicked out from Pierhead. How's that going to affect things?
Well, let me first of all pick up your comment about Fleetwood and places like that. The problem with Fleetwood is that it's a tidal harbour, and you can't really schedule into Fleetwood, even though we did for a bit. And certainly the Ben McCree couldn't get in on a regular basis. We're having enough trouble with Heysham at the moment because there's shifting sand, which the harbour operator doesn't dredge quite as often as we would like it to. So if you've got a full vessel, it can be quite a problem. But turning to Liverpool, we've known for 20 years that the Mersey Docks and Harbour Company wanted to move us off the landing stage because they wanted it for a cruise terminal. And Liverpool Corporation have also made it abundantly clear that they want rid of the steam packet from that particular position, not least for the traffic disruption that it causes. And eventually a site has been agreed. Now, we anticipated that we would be having to, make all the arrangements for that, but the government decided in its wisdom 2 or 3 years ago that it wanted to do it rather than us. So they took over the project. I think the price has got rather high. There are still various ideas as to whether they're going to have a landmark building there as a sort of introduction to the Isle of Man. But the last I heard was that it was going to cost something in the region of 30 million, which is an awful lot of money.
And no freight.
Well, that's a planning issue there, because don't forget there's an awful lot of private residences around there. My latest understanding is that there would be very limited freight, possibly at weekends, allowable through Liverpool, but it will not replace Heysham as our principal freight operation, which is a shame in a way, because our principal freight customers are based in sort of places like Skelmersdale, and it would be much easier and cheaper for them to bring their freight to Liverpool. But unfortunately, the new berth will be essentially passengers. It'll be a sea-cap berth. I think it may be able to take coaches, but it's not going to be able to take the amounts of freight that would allow us to move away from Heysham. Being serving one port would be an awful lot easier, but unfortunately Heysham wouldn't be the preferred option for a lot of our passenger traffic, and Liverpool is something we can't use for freight purposes.
Any chance of returning to places like Ardrossan with services? We hear this coming from Scottish people, where there was all sorts of... Llandudno was one place, Fleetwood, as we just said, yes. And you were exploring Holyhead at one time.
Well, we were looking at Holyhead because Holyhead would certainly be a suitable candidate for a one-port strategy. I don't know whether it would be very popular with the Manx public, but we could run freight and people into Holyhead, and if there'd been any problems with Liverpool or Heysham, that might have had to be the option.
A long way away from the mainland Lancashire, though, isn't it?
Well, there's a much better road. The A55 is much better, but it would add road journey to a lot of our customers. Yes, it was not our preferred option, but at the same time we had to look at all possibilities. Fleetwood I've already dealt with. Llandudno, well, there's only a pier at Llandudno. I once went on a day sailing to Llandudno when we had some of the old side loaders, and boy, the antics of some of the day trippers, well, they had to be seen to be believed. Some of them couldn't wait to get moored and were jumping into the sea off the boat as we moored at Llandudno. Ardrossan, I just don't think there's the business, Roger, sadly.
But the Scots used to say they could always tell the summer had started when the Manx boat came in.
Yeah, but they all go to Ibiza or Tenerife now, you see. I mean, the social habits have changed. The Isle of Man is not the sort of holiday resort for those sorts of people.
Not instantly, but could you create them back? You've got steam packet holidays, you've got all sorts of other things. Is there a marketing exercise there?
Well, Roger, we're basking in better weather than probably the Mediterranean at the moment, but the trouble is doesn't happen all of the time, and if it did happen all of the time, possibly we could go head to head with all these other places, Marbella as a tourist resort, but I don't think that's realistic.
Times have changed, yes,
indeed. Yes.
But what has changed?
That's not me being defeatist. It's just saying that I think we've got to be realistic.
It's a lot of people in Scotland. That's why I was thinking.
Yeah.
And it's a long way to go down to Heysham for some of them. It's
a long way to Ardrossan as well, actually, Roger. It's not the easiest place to get to.
Day excursions. Now, you've got day excursions to Liverpool, and that's a big grumble from some of the Manx people who say that you're exporting business to the shops in Liverpool.
Well, I think that's one of the things that the government is going to have to actually consider. If they're going to have a strategy which, let's say, favours the Manx residents, retailers are going to say, why are you actually giving subsidised fares or cheaper fares to Manx residents to go across and spend all their money in Liverpool One? And I can understand that. They're saying you're effectively going to sound the death knell of the Manx retail industry. Other people are saying, well, we should, reduce fares to get more people to come to the Isle of Man. And the Manx residents are going to say, well, hang on, why should the holidaymakers get a special deal? People are sufficiently canny to know that if there are special deals one way, they'll make sure they book their return fares to their homes in the Isle of Man from some spurious address in Liverpool to get the cheaper fare. So I think there are considerable dangers in having these fares that are adjusted to cater for one particular pressure group.
Day trips, let's go back to the old trip boats. They used to come in regular intervals, 2,000 people at a time. They used to spend about 5 hours, 6 hours here, spend quite a bit of money, especially in the pubs, and then they go back again. So they come and gone, same day. The steam packet got its whack out of them, and so did all the local shops.
Well, I think that it's, and ask the police, and apparently the levels of shoplifting used to go up as well on occasions.
Well, it did, yes.
But I'm sorry, I'm not ducking that one. I think those days are gone where people would come in to shop here. They may come on just for a sort of day out. And theoretically, they can still do that, but it would be rather a quick turnaround with the CCAT, because we do favour the local population in that we provide a CCAT service that gets you away from the island to Liverpool, and you can go in the morning and come back in the evening certain days of the week, but to do it the other way around would be quite difficult.
Yes, as a child, young man, my father used to send me out to the promenade at shops to Lockparade Church to tell him when the trip boat was in.
All right.
You know, and when it did used to bring quite a bit of temporary
and the other
uplift
thing,
in the business.
Yeah, and the other thing, of course, is, Roger, I mean, we always compare our fares with the airlines. It's not a totally fair comparison, because the airlines get favourable rates for using the airport, which means that, you know, they're slightly favoured over us. But I mean, you can do a day trip on EasyJet, let's say, or Flybe from Liverpool to here, if you want to, and it's probably, and the other way around, and it's probably actually cheaper for a passenger. But of course, if you buy a lot in Liverpool one, you have to pay an awful lot of surcharge to bring your luggage back.
All back. Yes.
Yes.
Now, we're talking about this particular deal. We started off by talking about the steam packet being bought by the Isle of Man government, effectively by the people. Now, Kate Beecroft immediately has taken up the task in Tynwald and the Keys, and she thinks government could have got a better deal, which is where we came in the conversation to start with. Is she right?
Well, I don't want to enter into the sort of political argument, because that's not my place to do so. I don't think our former shareholders, would have sold it for less, because they had done their maths and they had worked out that by continuing to run the company within the constraints of the user agreement till 2026, they could actually recoup the sort of money that they were looking to recoup. And in a sense, selling it now, using, you know, all these discounted rates and this sort of thing, effectively put them in the same position as they would have been if they'd continued to run the company till 2026. So Tynwald might well have been able to come up with a cheaper option, but of course we were incumbent till 2026. The price that our outgoing shareholders were prepared to take was what Tynwald bought it for. And don't forget, Tynwald did have some very, very learned advisors telling it that this was a fair price, you know, based on the value of the ships, on the value of the cash flows that the company would generate up to 2026. So it was a very well considered price.
Now, all of these figures, now the deal is done, have they been made public?
What figures
well,
are those?
Kate is arguing that commercial confidentiality shouldn't apply now, and the details of the deal should be published.
And I'm not going to break that. I mean, that's not my place. Not my place to do that. If Tynwald decides in its wisdom that it's going to publish certain of that information, well, that's up to Tynwald.
It could be argued that as it's public money, it should be.
Well, yes, but you've also got to respect the commercial confidentiality of the company before Tynwald acquired it.
Well, okay. But that is a debate that could go on for some time,
Well,
I think.
It could do, and I'm not going to enter into it.
But how, Mrs. Beecroft also asked the Minister for Infrastructure how his department sought to ensure that there are no direct costs to the taxpayer for the provision and implementation of a reliable sea service during the purchase of the steam packet company. In other words, well, I suppose what she's wanting is an assurance that it'll self-finance. Now, there's no reason why it should not do that, is there?
How do you mean self-finance?
Well, it shouldn't call upon government for any funds in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. I mean, the point is that at the moment, that the way the deal has been structured, part of the effectively acquisition price was taking over an existing debt of 70+ million, which is short-term lent by the government to the company. Now, one of the first tasks that's going to await the new shareholders and the company is to replace that debt with maybe external debt. And in due course, the acquisition of new vessels can be dealt with as it would be in most companies by a mixture of own resources and external financing, and that's probably the way it'll be done. So it doesn't need to call on the Isle of Man government for those funds, and it will be an attractive covenant for any lender because the government owns the company.
Now, we just had an email in here, and I appreciate that normally we would deal with this in the Manning line, but it's popped in here now from Steve, who says if the government wholly owned Steam Packet, it could be run at near break-even figure. Then fares could be reduced, not only to attract more people here, but also to help residents not paying higher prices from here than someone visiting. The problem with this is shareholders who demand a return. Now, in other words, he's saying that now state owns it, we should be looking for less profit.
Well, I think that's up to Tynwald to decide. They have lashed out 100+ million of taxpayers' money, and it's yours and my money. Now, I'm assuming that they did that on the basis that they would get some kind of return for that money, because otherwise they'd be getting a return elsewhere. I can't see Tynwald being particularly happy, at least some members of Tynwald being particularly happy to have that level of government funding out there and not getting any return on it. Yes, if they decide they want no return or a smaller return, that money will have to go towards new ships, and it can be used to reduce fares. And don't forget that in the company's own Strategic Sea Services Agreement proposals, there were significant proposals relating to fares. And there would have been more concessionary fares, there would have been special sail and save type fares, and certain groups favoured, like students. So there was a real attempt to try and put more money back, if the company was successful, into fare reduction.
That's still on record, of course.
Yes, it is, yeah.
Now, one point is this, talking about new ships, which may or may not come in the foreseeable future. And you had put in a figure of something like 60 million for new ships in that particular, somewhere in that region. But would they have needed a new harbour facilities? Because most of these ships that you see sailing the Irish Sea or anywhere else these days are bigger, they're longer, if anything else.
Yeah, we're limited on what we can get into Douglas Harbour and what we can get into Heysham. And I think it's about 140 metres, which means that the vessels that most of the other Irish sea operators and other, channel ferry operators operate would not fit into our harbours. That's been one of the big constraints on finding additional charter tonnage for things like TT. We have had to make do and mend and have our own vessels, and it also dictates that we will have to probably go and buy new from a shipyard, a replacement for the Ben McCree, because there just aren't any vessels of that size floating around anywhere around the world that are suitable for this route.
We are getting a reaction already, Robert, which I just read to you. Just a little irksome to hear the slight ha in Mr. Quayle's use of language. They wanted it, they got it, now they can sort it, says Claire.
No, well, that's not true. I mean, the Tynwald has acquired it. They've got to decide how they want to run it, because I think there are quite a few different views within Tynwald itself, as well as in the community, as to how they will run it.
Yeah. Now, there's a long, I'd like to read it, Robert, but there's a long email coming here, which I'll have to read again to understand, so I haven't got quite time to do it. But that takes us, I suppose, back to where we came in now. And thank you for being with us. But where do we go to from here? Well, I mean, you say you're waiting to find out certain ideas,
well,
but
you
must be playing a part somewhere.
We're in discussion with the representatives of the new owners, yes, as to how they want the company run. The management of the company will obviously be very mindful of the wishes of the new owners. That's what we're there to translate into fact. And I've promised to stay on for the next 6 months, but then it definitely will be my time to walk away into the sunset, to try and help in the transition process. Tynwald will have to decide its policy on what it wants to do with the company now it owns it. And I think there's quite a lot of discussions. Tynwald's like herding cats at times. And I can say that having worked there for many years. Democracy is fine, but actually it's getting consensus that's critical, and they've got to reach a consensus as to how they want the company operated.